The truck rattled over the uneven dirt road, its worn tires kicking up clouds of dust as the sun beat down mercilessly from the sky. The air shimmered with heat, turning the landscape into a distorted, wavering illusion of red sand and brittle shrubs. Thomas Bennett kept his hands tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. The old engine whined in protest, the temperature gauge creeping dangerously high, but he didn't ease off the gas. Not yet. Rocky lay curled in the passenger seat, his grizzled muzzle resting on the cracked upholstery. His cloudy, lifeless eyes stared ahead, though they saw nothing. He had always trusted Thomas. Even now, as the smell of hot metal and dry earth filled the cab, he sighed contentedly, unaware of where they were going. Unaware of what was coming. Thomas swallowed hard, ignoring the sting in his throat. This was necessary, he told himself. He had been telling himself that since sunrise when he had loaded Rocky into the truck, avoiding the dog's expectant wag of his tail, pretending he didn't hear the soft, hopeful whimper as he closed the door. It had to be done. A blind dog was useless on a farm. He had no time, no money, no patience to care for an animal that was nothing but a burden. The truck skidded to a halt on a patch of cracked earth, miles away from anything recognizable. No houses, no roads, just an endless stretch of sand and scrub. The silence here was suffocating, thick, and unmoving. Thomas cut the engine and listened to the hot metal ticking, the cooling parts settling with a quiet finality. He reached over and ran his hand along Rocky's back, feeling the dog's ribs under his thin coat. Rocky responded with a weak, grateful lick to Thomas's wrist. It nearly undid him. But Thomas gritted his teeth and grabbed the door handle. "Come on, boy," he muttered, voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Rocky stirred, ears pricking up, his tail thumping once against the seat. He tried to stand, but his legs were stiff, slow to obey. Thomas sighed and scooped him up, feeling the weight of the dog pressing against his chest. Too light. Too frail. He had always been strong, but now he felt fragile in Thomas's arms, like an old, worn-out thing that had been stretched thin over time. Thomas carried him several paces away from the truck before setting him down. Rocky's paws hit the scorching ground, and he hesitated, sniffing the air, confused. The heat was overwhelming, the scent unfamiliar. Rocky turned his head toward Thomas, blinking his sightless eyes, as if waiting for a command. Thomas took a step back. Then another. He turned on his heel and walked swiftly back to the truck, his boots crunching against the dry soil. Rocky whimpered. Thomas didn't look back. He yanked the door open and climbed inside, slamming it shut with too much force. His fingers trembled as he jammed the key into the ignition, twisting hard. The engine roared to life, drowning out the sound of Rocky's hesitant steps as he tried to follow. Thomas gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from breaking apart. Then, before he could change his mind, he threw the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spat up a cloud of dust as the truck lurched forward. Rocky barked, a desperate, startled yelp. Thomas's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. He could feel it though. The image of Rocky standing there, ears perked, tail twitching with uncertainty. Then the barking started again. Louder this time. Panicked, Thomas pressed harder on the gas. The barking grew fainter. Then silence. The moment the noise stopped, something inside Thomas cracked. The heat in the truck became unbearable, pressing against him from all sides, smothering. He rolled down the window, gasping for air, but all he got was dust and the bitter taste of his own guilt. Still he didn't stop. Rocky was blind. He wouldn't find his way back. And Thomas? Thomas didn't deserve to be followed. The sun hung like a cruel overseer in the sky, watching Rocky struggle through the endless wasteland. The heat pressed down on him like a heavy weight, suffocating, relentless. Each step was a battle against the burning sand beneath his paws, each breath a painful rasp in his throat. His tongue lolled out, dry and cracked, as he panted desperately, trying to cool himself. But there was no relief. Only heat. Only thirst. Rocky didn't know where he was. He didn't know why Thomas had left him. But he knew, with the fading instinct of a dog who had once belonged, that he had been abandoned. The realization clung to him, heavier than the sun, heavier than the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He had trusted Thomas, followed his voice, felt safe in his presence even when the world had turned dark around him. Now, there was no voice to follow. Only silence. His legs trembled as he staggered forward. His paws, softened from a life of familiarity, cracked open on the harsh ground, leaving small, dark stains behind him. He was panting harder now, his ribs jutting sharply against his thinning coat, his body draining faster than it could recover. Each step was agony. Each second, a question of whether he could take another. Then, his nose caught something. Water. It was faint, almost buried beneath the stench of dust and dryness, but it was there. His instincts flared, and with a final, desperate push, he stumbled forward, following the scent like a thread of hope pulling him through the suffocating heat. His ears twitched, listening for any sign of movement, any threat lurking unseen in the emptiness. And then, his paws hit something solid. An old, rusted water trough, forgotten by time, stood before him. Rocky's cracked nose bumped against the metal as he sniffed feverishly. His heart pounded in his chest, his dry tongue reaching forward. There was barely anything left. A shallow pool of stagnant water, coated in dirt and insect husks, shimmered at the bottom. It reeked of decay, of heat and neglect. But Rocky didn't hesitate. He lowered his head and lapped at it greedily, his body shaking with the effort. The water was warm, bitter, thick with filth. But it was water. And for a fleeting moment, it soothed the fire in his throat, numbed the pain clawing through his exhausted frame. Then, it was gone. Rocky licked the empty trough, desperate for more, but there was nothing left. He nudged it with his nose, his body trembling from weakness, but it did not give. His tongue, still dry, rasped against the metal, searching for any drop he might have missed. A sharp wind blew through the wasteland, carrying the scent of dust and loneliness, ruffling Rocky's thinning fur. His ears drooped. His tail, once so eager to wag at the sound of Thomas's voice, hung limp behind him. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. His legs buckled. He slumped against the trough, his side pressing against the metal, the last of his energy slipping from his body. The sky swirled above him, waves of heat distorting the horizon, blurring the edges of the world. How much longer could he go on? His breath came in short, shallow gasps. His muscles, drained and useless, refused to move. Somewhere, far away, Thomas was driving home. Maybe he was already there, washing his hands, sitting down to eat, forgetting the dog who had once curled up at his feet. Rocky would never make it back. He would never hear Thomas's voice again. A weak whimper slipped from his throat. It was the only sound in the vast, empty desert. Then silence. The desert cooled as night fell, but the relief was cruel. The air, once suffocating with heat, turned sharp and biting, cutting through Rocky's thinning fur. His body, weakened from exhaustion, shivered as he lay against the dry ground. The hunger gnawed at his stomach, twisting it into painful knots, but the thirst was worse. It was an unbearable, torturous void, a dry, aching hollowness in his throat that no amount of panting could ease. His ears twitched at every sound, the whisper of wind through the cracked earth, the distant rustle of unseen creatures moving in the darkness. Fear curled around him, heavier than his exhaustion. He was blind, defenseless. Then, something changed. A presence. The air carried a scent, strong, unfamiliar, and laced with something sharp, something alive. Rocky stiffened, his muscles tensing even as his legs refused to obey. His ears swiveled, straining to pinpoint the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Then a voice. Low, steady, and laced with something Rocky couldn't quite place. Amusement? Pity? You're far from home, aren't you? Rocky's head lifted slightly, his ears perking. The sound came from just beyond his reach, somewhere in the darkness, steady and calm, unhurried. A shape moved. Rocky couldn't see it, but he felt it. A shift in the air, the quiet crunch of paws against sand. Then, the scent grew stronger, closer, wrapping around him like an unseen force. Another dog. Not weak. Not starving. Not lost. A presence of power. Rocky's tail twitched slightly, his body on high alert despite his failing strength. He knew better than to trust too easily. He had been led. He had been abandoned. The world had shown him its cruelty. The stranger stepped forward. "You don't smell like you belong here," the voice continued, a hint of curiosity woven into the words. "Farm dog, huh?" Rocky didn't answer. He couldn't. His dry tongue barely moved in his mouth. The other dog circled him slowly, deliberate, controlled. Rocky could feel the presence looming just out of reach, inspecting him, assessing him. The weight of the stranger's gaze pressed against his thin frame like another burden to bear. "You're not going to last long out here," the voice said, casual as if stating a fact. "You already look half dead." Rocky let out a weak breath, lowering his head slightly. He didn't need to be told. He knew. The other dog stopped moving. For a long moment, there was silence, just the wind shifting the sand, the distant cry of something far off in the night. Then, the stranger spoke again, voice softer this time. "You were left, weren't you?" Rocky flinched. The words hit him harder than he expected. The stranger didn't say lost. Didn't say ran away. He said left. Like he knew. Like he understood. Rocky swallowed, his throat raw, his body trembling as his last bit of strength drained from him. He wanted to deny it. Wanted to stand, to prove he wasn't as broken as he felt. But he was. And they both knew it. The other dog let out a small huff, neither cruel nor kind. "Humans," he muttered as if the word itself was a curse. Then, to Rocky's shock, the presence moved closer, not circling, not stalking, just stepping forward with quiet certainty. And for the first time since he had been left behind, Rocky didn't feel alone. A warm breath ghosted over Rocky's muzzle, startling him. He stiffened, his body instinctively preparing for the worst, but there was no pain, no threat. Only the soft, steady presence of another. Then hutch, gentle, brief. The unknown dog pressed his nose against Rocky's face, an act so foreign in this cruel, merciless place that it nearly undid him. Rocky flinched at first. The instinct to withdraw, to shrink back, was strong. He had been left to die. Left to suffer alone under the blistering sun and now the freezing night. Every scent, every sound had been nothing but a warning, a sign of another enemy, another danger waiting to take advantage of his weakness. But this was different. The stranger didn't pull away immediately. He remained close, his warmth steady against the cold air, his breath slow and measured. Rocky's dry throat worked, his body still trembling from exhaustion, but something deep within him, something old, buried beneath hunger and thirst, recognized the gesture. It wasn't pity. It wasn't dominance. It was simply presence. Rocky, hesitant, almost fearful, let out a slow, shaky breath. He had spent what felt like an eternity in silence, lost in a void of emptiness, surrounded by nothing but his own suffering. Now, for the first time since Thomas had walked away, he was not alone. The other dog didn't move. He just stood there, waiting, his breathing even, his posture calm but unreadable. He had no reason to stay. No obligation. He could have passed Rocky by like everyone else, left him to fade into the dust, to become another forgotten scrap of life swallowed by the desert. But he hadn't. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. The wind whispered through the darkness, kicking up dust and sand, but neither of them moved. Rocky didn't know what to do with this moment. The stranger's scent filled his nose, a mixture of earth and sweat, of something wild and untamed. He wasn't like Rocky, he wasn't soft from years of human care, wasn't broken by the betrayal of the hand that had once fed him. He was strong, hardened, a creature of survival, but he hadn't turned away in disgust at Rocky's weakness. He had stayed. Rocky swallowed against the dryness in his throat. His legs felt like they would collapse if he tried to stand. His body still screamed for water, for food, for anything to dull the agony of what he had been through. But for the first time, the weight of being unwanted didn't crush him completely. The unknown dog let out a quiet exhale, then settled down beside him, his movements slow, unhurried. He wasn't in a rush to leave. He wasn't going anywhere. Rocky, fragile and worn, felt something unfamiliar press against the hollow ache in his chest. The night stretched endlessly over the desert, vast and merciless, but Rocky was no longer alone. He lay in the sand, his body aching, his breath shallow, yet the presence beside him remained steady. The unknown dog had not spoken again, had not pushed him to move, had not abandoned him like Thomas had. He simply stayed. It was this quiet patience, this silent companionship, that finally gave Rocky the strength to try. His legs trembled as he shifted, his paws unsteady beneath him. Every part of him protested. His cracked pads, his dry throat, the unbearable weight of exhaustion pressing him down. He had spent hours, maybe days, wandering in a daze, waiting for the desert to claim him. But something had changed. He wasn't sure why this stranger had stopped for him, why he hadn't been left behind like before, but it didn't matter. Rocky took a slow, shuddering breath and pushed himself upward. His muscles screamed, his head swam, but he refused to fall. The other dog rose beside him, silent, watchful. He didn't offer help, didn't nudge Rocky forward or bark at him to hurry. He just waited, his calm presence like a force holding Rocky together when everything else threatened to break him apart. Rocky lifted his head, his blind eyes staring into the black nothingness ahead. Then, step by step, he followed. The ground was rough beneath his paws, sharp stones and dry roots tearing at his pads, but he kept moving. The night wind whipped against his thinning fur, chilling him to the bone, but he kept moving. His body ached, his ribs burned with every breath, but he kept moving. Because for the first time since Thomas had abandoned him, he wanted to move. The unknown dog led the way, his steps sure and deliberate. He never ran ahead, never left Rocky behind, always keeping just close enough for Rocky to sense him, to follow the faint sound of his paws against the dirt. Neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The desert stretched behind them, empty and vast, swallowing the place where Rocky had once collapsed, waiting to die. The world had tried to forget him, but he refused to let it. Rocky didn't know where they were going. He didn't know if water, food, or shelter lay ahead. He didn't know if he was walking towards salvation or another kind of suffering. But it didn't matter. Because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't following the sound of Thomas's voice. He was following something real. Something strong. Something that stayed. The journey was brutal. Each step was a war against exhaustion, against the pain in Rocky's paws, against the cruel hunger gnawing at his belly. His body had been weak before, but now it was pushed beyond its limits. The only thing keeping him moving was the presence beside him, the quiet, unwavering strength of the dog who had found him in the darkness and refused to leave. They walked through endless stretches of wasteland, guided only by instinct and the faint scent of something beyond the desert. A place where the air no longer burned the lungs, where the wind carried something other than the taste of dust. Rocky didn't know where they were going, but he followed because there was no other choice. Days passed. The sun, ruthless and unrelenting, drained the last reserves of his strength. The nights, cold and merciless, stole what little warmth his thin body could hold. More than once, his legs gave out, sending him collapsing into the dirt, his ribs pressing hard against his skin. But every time, the other dog stopped. Waited. And when Rocky managed to stand again, the journey continued. Then, finally, something changed. The smell of dry wood. Of animals. Of something human. A ranch. Rocky didn't hear the man at first. His senses were dulled, his body barely functioning beyond the slow, dragging movements of his legs. But the other dog stopped, ears perked, his body still and alert. A presence. A voice. "Well, now," the man said, his voice rough with age, with the weight of years spent under the sun. "Ain't you a tough one?" Rocky swayed, his legs trembling violently beneath him. He could feel the man's gaze on him, studying him, weighing something in his mind. Then footsteps. Slow. Approaching. Rocky barely had the strength to react when a hand touched him. Firm, but not cruel. Not like Thomas. There was no anger, no impatience in the grip that steadied his failing body. Just something steady. Something real. "You been through hell, huh?" the man murmured. Still standing though, Rocky let out a slow, shuddering breath. The other dog stayed close, his presence a silent promise that whatever happened next, Rocky wouldn't be alone. Then the man sighed, deep and thoughtful. "Come on then," he said, his voice softer than before. "Let's get you fed." The scent of food hit Rocky before he saw it. Water. Something real, something that didn't taste of dust and desperation. He ate slowly at first, afraid it might be a trick, afraid it would be ripped away. But the food stayed. The water stayed. The hands that fed him weren't rough. They stayed. Days passed. The ranch became something more than a place to survive. It became a place where Rocky learned to live again. His body healed. Slowly. The pain never truly left, but it dulled, became something he could bear. His paws grew stronger. His steps became surer. The other dog never left his side. And the man, Jacob Carter, never raised his hand to strike. Never threw him away. Never called him useless. For the first time in his life, Rocky wasn't just surviving. He belonged. And for a dog who had once been left to die, that was everything.